Numerous organizations and studies have investigated the potential health effects of exposure to electromagnetic fields from electrical infrastructure, including substations. The World Health Organization, WHO, published a report in 2007 titled Electromagnetic Fields and Public Health Exposure to Power Frequency Fields, as well as Health Effects of Extremely Low Frequency Electromagnetic Fields. These documents provide assessments of the available scientific evidence regarding potential health risks associated with EMF exposure. The International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection (ICNIRP) released guidelines in 2020 titled Guidelines for Limiting Exposure to Time-Varying Electric and Magnetic Fields, 1 Hz to 100 kHz. These guidelines establish exposure limits for electric and magnetic fields to protect public health. The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, NIEHS, conducted a comprehensive research program on residential electromagnetic fields, publishing a final report in 2003. This report summarizes the findings of numerous studies investigating the potential health effects of EMF exposure in residential settings. A meta-analysis by Leng et al. In 2020 examined the relationship between residential exposure to 50/60 Hz magnetic fields and childhood leukemia. The analysis, which pulled data from 14 studies, found no association between magnetic fields from power lines and childhood leukemia. The WHO's 2007 report, Health Effects of Extremely Low Frequency Electromagnetic Fields (ALFEMF), reviewed numerous studies and concluded that there is no convincing evidence of cancer or other adverse health effects from EMF exposure. The NIEHS' 2003 report, Residential Electromagnetic Fields Research, found no consistent evidence of adverse health effects from exposure to 60 Hz magnetic fields. It is important to note that there are limited studies specifically investigating the health effects of living or working near electrical utility substations. However, the available evidence suggests that exposure to electromagnetic fields from substations is generally low and within safety guidelines. The National Cancer Institute published a fact sheet in 2010 titled Power Lines and Cancer Questions and Answers. This document states that the majority of studies have not found an association between living near substations and cancer. The New York State Department of Health conducted an assessment of cancer risk near electrical substations in 2015. The study found that magnetic field exposures near substations in New York State were typically below ICNIRP guidelines and that there was no evidence of an increased cancer risk. The available documentation and recorded studies generally conclude that there is no convincing evidence of adverse health effects from exposure to electromagnetic fields from electrical utility substations. However, it is important to acknowledge that research is ongoing and further studies are needed to fully understand the potential health impacts of long-term exposure to electromagnetic fields. Understanding electromagnetic fields, or EMF, requires understanding electric fields and magnetic fields as separate, yet related, phenomena. Electric fields are created by voltage, which is the electric potential difference between 2 points. The higher the voltage, the stronger the electric field. Electric fields are measured in volts per meter or volt/meter. Magnetic fields are created by moving electric charges, or current. The greater the current, the stronger the magnetic field. Magnetic fields are measured in units of Tesla, or T, or more commonly in microteslas, UT, or milligauss, mg, where 1 microtesla equals 10 milligauss. Power frequency fields are those associated with the generation, transmission, and distribution of electrical power. In most countries, the power frequency is either 50 Hz or 60 Hz. These frequencies are considered extremely low frequency, ELF, within the electromagnetic spectrum. Electrical substations are facilities that contain equipment for switching, transforming, and regulating voltage in the electrical power system. Substations play a critical role in delivering electricity from generating plants to consumers. Equipment in substations, such as transformers, switchgear, and busbars, can produce electric and magnetic fields. The strength of these fields depends on factors such as the voltage and current levels, the design of the equipment, and the distance from the source. Exposure to EMF from substations can occur in areas surrounding the facility. The strength of the fields decreases rapidly with distance. Therefore, exposure levels are typically highest close to the substation and decrease significantly as you move further away. International guidelines, such as those published by ICNIRP, establish limits on exposure to electric and magnetic fields to protect public health. These guidelines are based on a thorough review of the scientific literature and are designed to prevent adverse health effects from exposure to EMF. Many countries have adopted these guidelines or have established their own national standards. EMF exposure levels near substations are typically low and within established safety guidelines. Studies have shown that the levels of EMF in areas surrounding substations are generally comparable to or lower than those found in other environments, such as near household appliances or office equipment. Numerous studies have investigated the potential health effects of exposure to power frequency EMF. These studies have examined a wide range of health outcomes, including cancer, reproductive health, neurological disorders, and cardiovascular disease. Overall, the scientific evidence does not support the conclusion that exposure to power frequency EMF causes adverse health effects. Some studies have suggested a possible association between exposure to magnetic fields and childhood leukemia. However, this association is weak and inconsistent, and it may be due to chance or other factors. Furthermore, meta-analyses of multiple studies have not found a clear association between magnetic fields and childhood leukemia. The WHO has concluded that there is no convincing evidence that exposure to power frequency EMF causes cancer or other adverse health effects. However, the WHO also recognizes that further research is needed to address remaining uncertainties and to better understand the potential long-term health effects of EMF exposure. Research on EMF and health is ongoing, and scientists continue to investigate the potential health effects of exposure to electromagnetic fields. This research includes laboratory studies, epidemiological studies, and risk assessments. Laboratory studies examine the effects of EMF on cells and animals. Epidemiological studies investigate the relationship between EMF exposure and health outcomes in human populations. Risk assessments evaluate the potential risks associated with EMF exposure based on the available scientific evidence. It is important to stay informed about the latest scientific findings on EMF and health. Reliable sources of information include the WHO, the NIEHS, and other reputable scientific organizations. These organizations provide evidence-based information on EMF and health and can help you make informed decisions about your exposure to electromagnetic fields. While the scientific evidence does not support the conclusion that exposure to EMF from substations causes adverse health effects, some people may be concerned about potential risks. If you are concerned about EMF exposure, there are several steps you can take to reduce your exposure. Firstly, increase your distance from sources of EMF. The strength of electric and magnetic fields decreases rapidly with distance, so increasing your distance from sources of EMF, such as substations or power lines, can significantly reduce your exposure. Secondly, shield yourself from EMF. Shielding materials, such as metal screens or special paints, can block or reduce EMF. Shielding may be appropriate in certain situations, such as if you live very close to a substation or power line. Thirdly, turn off or move electrical devices. Electrical devices, such as appliances and computers, produce EMF. When not in use, turn off electrical devices or move them further away from you. Understanding safety guidelines requires a look at the ICNIRP guidelines, as they provide recommended limits for exposure to electric and magnetic fields at different frequencies, including power frequencies 50/60 Hz. These guidelines are based on established health effects and are designed to protect the general public from adverse health outcomes. The electric field reference levels for occupational exposure at 50/60 Hz are typically around 8.3 kV/meter, while for the general public, they are around 4.2 kV/meter. These levels are set to prevent acute effects, such as nerve stimulation and shock. The magnetic field reference levels for occupational exposure at 50/60 Hz are around 500 microteslas, while for the general public, they are around 100 microteslas. These levels are set to prevent effects such as induced currents in the body that could potentially lead to health issues. Substations are designed to comply with these safety standards and regulations. Regular monitoring and maintenance are conducted to ensure that EMF levels remain within the established limits. Safety measures include grounding, shielding, and the use of appropriate equipment to minimize EMF emissions. Concerns about childhood leukemia have been raised in relation to EMF exposure, particularly from power lines. However, the scientific evidence regarding this potential link is inconclusive. While some studies have suggested a possible association, others have found no evidence of increased risk. Major reviews by organizations like the WHO and the National Cancer Institute have concluded that the evidence is not strong enough to establish a causal relationship between EMF exposure and childhood leukemia. The New York State Department of Health conducted a comprehensive assessment of cancer risk near electrical substations. The assessment included a review of scientific literature, an analysis of EMF levels near substations, and an evaluation of cancer incidence rates in areas surrounding substations. The findings of the assessment indicated that magnetic field exposures near substations in New York State were typically below ICNIRP guidelines. Furthermore, there was no evidence of an increased cancer risk in areas surrounding substations. These findings provide further reassurance that living or working near electrical substations does not pose a significant health risk. When evaluating claims or concerns about EMF and health, it is important to consider the source of the information. Rely on reputable sources such as government agencies, scientific organizations, and health professionals. Be wary of unsubstantiated claims or information from biased sources. Also, consider the weight of evidence. Scientific evidence is based on a body of research, not just individual studies. Look for consensus among experts and organizations regarding the potential health effects of EMF exposure. Additionally, consider the context of the information. EMF exposure levels vary depending on the source and distance. Compare exposure levels to establish safety guidelines and consider the potential for exposure in your specific environment. There are steps that can be taken to reduce EMF exposure in the vicinity of substations. The design and construction of substations can incorporate measures to minimize EMF emissions. These measures include grounding, shielding, and the use of equipment that generates lower EMF levels. Regular monitoring and maintenance of substations can help ensure that EMF levels remain within established limits. Public education and outreach can provide information about EMF and health and can help address concerns or misconceptions. The operation of electrical equipment produces both electric and magnetic fields. Electric fields are produced by voltage and their strength is measured in volts per meter or volt/meter. Magnetic fields are produced by current, and their strength is measured in Tesla, or T, or more commonly in microteslas, UT. The frequency of EMF is measured in Hertz, or Hc, which represents the number of cycles per second. Power frequency EMF, such as that produced by electrical substations, is typically 50/60 Hz. Exposure to EMF decreases rapidly with distance from the source. The inverse square law states that the intensity of EMF decreases proportionally to the square of the distance from the source. Therefore, doubling the distance from the source reduces the exposure to 1/4 of the original level. EMF can interact with the human body through various mechanisms. Electric fields can induce surface charges on the body, while magnetic fields can induce circulating currents within the body. The extent of these interactions depends on factors such as the frequency and intensity of the EMF, as well as the size and orientation of the body. Exposure to high levels of EMF can cause acute health effects, such as nerve stimulation and shock. However, exposure to low levels of EMF, such as those typically found near electrical substations, is not believed to cause acute health effects. Some people may experience sensitivity to EMF, which is also known as electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EIS. People with EHS may report a variety of symptoms such as headaches, fatigue, and skin irritation, which they attribute to EMF exposure. However, studies have not consistently shown a link between EMF exposure and EHS symptoms. EMF is a complex and multifaceted issue, and there are many different perspectives and viewpoints on the potential health effects of exposure. It is important to approach this issue with a critical and open mind and to consider all available evidence before forming an opinion. In conclusion, while research continues, the current consensus among scientific and health organizations is that living or working near electrical substations does not pose a significant health hazard, as long as EMF levels are within established safety guidelines.